Welcome to the Election University podcast, a weekly show where we hear from industry experts who share tips and tricks for winning campaigns. Whether you're running for office now, thinking about it for the future, or just want to know more about campaigns and elections, Election University is for you. With Election University, click, learn, win. And now your host, Jason Bennett and Rainey Cohen.
Hello.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Technical difficulties here at Election University headquarters. God, we're like 30 minutes behind schedule. This is not good.
You know what? But it's okay because we rearranged Election University Podcast Central. I'm digging this new setup.
It's pretty nice.
Now that we have powered through the difficulties, we're going to be so good to go.
Yeah, hopefully our guest today is still hanging on for dear life.
It's going to be fine.
We'll get to him in a second. So thanks for joining us for another episode of Election University Podcast. I am your co-host, Jason Bennett.
And I'm Rainey Cohen.
And we are excited about today's episode. The idea came to me after listening to an episode of another favorite podcast of mine, The Wilderness, which is basically the autopsy of the 2016 election cycle by Jon Favreau, who is one of the co-hosts of Pod Save America.
Yeah.
Former Obama speechwriter.
Awesome podcast. Brilliant
guy. And The Wilderness is fantastic for any of you who are interested in reliving the pain and the agony of the 2016 election cycle. And more importantly, learning your lessons and understanding what direction the Democratic Party should go in. And more importantly, the presidential race. It's an excellent podcast. Anyway, they have long spent an enormous amount of time trashing consultants, the consultant class, direct mail, TV ads, and they are very in favor of moving more towards the digital model. And in their episode on the party, essentially, they wanted to take an opportunity to really drive the point home, and they did. They were successful. But I thought, okay, well, let's talk to some data. Let's figure this out. And really, it's easy to, take a punching bag like consultants, political consultants, and make a point. But is mail really dead? Are the traditional methods of how we're communicating with voters, how we're motivating people to participate, are they dead? Are we really using old models that don't work anymore?
I mean, I hear all the time that like mail is having this resurgence, like just mail in general, particularly among millennials who don't get a ton of mail. And so it's like a special thing when something shows up in your mailbox.
Yep.
I wouldn't know. I go weeks without checking my mailbox. So I grab a giant pile and be like, oh, I missed the birth announcement of my best friend's baby, which arrived forever ago. And now I have to like, hey, thanks for sending me that. Sorry, it took weeks for me to notice that you sent me something awesome.
Yeah, and I'm a Gen Xer, and I don't even read my own mail. Yeah. And that's been a long time coming. I just am not a mail person. I'm never home, and why would you send me a piece of mail when you can email it to me or text it to me? And it's funny because what you're referring to is a United Postal Service study that they did a few years ago talking about the impacts of mail on all generations. Yeah. And who's reading it and is it surging? Obviously, they had a vested interest in promoting the resurgence of mail, but it was an interesting study and did flip, I think, some conventional wisdom on its head. And then you read these reports that come out that one of the reasons that millennials aren't voting is because they don't know where to buy stamps, for example, right? Yeah. So, which I also take with a huge grain of salt. We should have another episode on that. But let's get to today. So we wanted to, really spend some time on data and having folks debunk or affirm or be completely neutral on the point of whether or not direct mail is effective. Is it dead? Should we be moving towards other more cost-effective, certainly more cost-effective, but, more 21st century types of methodologies? And so we're going to be going to the Voter Participation Center today and talking with Lionel Dripps, who is one of their consultants there that does work in this space.
Mm-hmm. The Voter Participation Center has a ton of data on direct mail, and they use that data to target folks for GOTV efforts and voter registration. So what I really like about this episode is that we're not talking to one of the consultants who have candidate campaigns that they're working on, who are just going to be like, yes, mail works all the time. No offense, Jason.
None taken.
But I really am curious about how mail works in the GOTV voter registration space, maybe in comparison to persuasion about candidates. And Lionel has so much expertise on this issue.
Yeah. And the Voter Participation Center's focus is on what they deem the rising American electorate, which is unmarried women, people of color, and millennials, and engaging and enhancing their civic engagement in elections. And so I'm excited to talk to him about this. Lionel Dripps is the managing director. Let's get his title correct. Managing director for program and digital at the Voter Participation Center. He is vice president of the Pivot Group. He's the executive director of the DSCC, regional director for the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. Oh, I didn't notice that he's a Scotty like me. Excellent. I'm going to ask him where he's from. I'm going to spend a little time on that. And then he was a campaign manager for O'Donnell for Colorado. So he has obviously a ton of campaign experience that he's bringing to the table. And I'm really excited to get into his brain and find out, let's get to the
Let's
data.
dive in.
Let's get into a spreadsheet and find out what's going on with direct mail.
Tab over.
Yeah, exactly. Lionel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Although I should point out, it's actually Lionel.
Oh no.
My apologies.
Lionel, thank you for joining us today.
Everybody gets it wrong.
Okay.
Woo. Yeah, we need to put an accent or something over some part of your name.
We should verify this before we, ask people to join.
Good grief. All right, so let's get into it. Thank you for joining us. If you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you got involved in politics, we'd love to hear a bit more about your origin story.
Sure. So I guess I got involved. At first more as an activist and a volunteer back in the early 2000s. I was one of these people who was motivated to get more involved in politics due to the Iraq War. But basically after 2008 is when I basically became professionally involved in politics. And I started out, as many people do, as a field organizer, and then working on a few state legislative campaigns in Virginia and in Colorado and in Wisconsin. I ended up running the Colorado Senate caucus for the Democrats in the Colorado Senate in 2012. And then from there, when I moved to D.C. with my wife, my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, joined a direct mail firm. And then about a year and a half ago, started in my current job as the program director at the Voter Participation Center.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the work of the Voter Participation Center?
Absolutely. So VPC, as we call it,
How hip.
is, I know, another acronym, right? But VPC works to basically correct what we view as a major failing in American democracy, which is the people who vote on election day are not representative of the actual population in this country.
Yeah.
And specifically, there is a group of Americans which we define as the rising American electorate. And these are people of color, these are unmarried women, and these are young people. They make up the majority, actually a pretty substantial majority, almost 60% of the population in this country. But on election day, they do not nearly represent the majority, or they do not nearly reflect their as voters. And this is true in presidential elections, but this is particularly true in midterm elections. So the work of VPC is trying to combat that. And we do this in a couple of ways. One way is it starts with just getting people registered. There are barriers in this country to registration, and those barriers disproportionately affect people in these demographic groups. So we run large-scale programs trying to make it as easy as possible for people, these underrepresented Americans, to actually register. So one of the things we do is we send out millions upon millions of pieces of voter registration mail, where we comb through the data, we try to identify specific individuals who we believe are not registered to vote at their current address, and we will send them a voter registration form. In many states, we will even pre-populate this form with this person's name and address, and then we'll include in a envelope a return envelope that they can use to send their voter registration application on to their state or local election officials.
Literally couldn't be easier.
That's exactly right. That's our whole goal. We want it to be, a 2-minute process of just completing the form, signing it, sticking it in the mail, and then, hopefully, shortly thereafter, you'll get your voter registration card from your local election office.
Can we go back to the rising American electorate for just a second? People of color and young people make sense to me, but what's the deal with unmarried women?
So the founder of VPC, a woman named Paige Gardner, basically after the 2000 election, the 2000 presidential election, she was looking through census data and trying to basically figure out, how did this happen? How did we end up with Bush and not with Gore?
Hanging chads, that's why.
Yeah.
Well, right. It made many reasons. The Supreme Court.
Yes, exactly.
Very topical right now. But what she found in looking through the census data is that marital status is a predictor of both voting behavior, who do you vote for, as well as turnout behavior. Do you vote at all? Are you registered to vote? And she was very interested in this. And over the few years between work that she did and some others in this field, really determined that, if you run some regression analyses and you hold out for marital status, controlling for, economic status, race, all sorts of other factors that might contribute, what you discover is that marital status is a predictor of political participation, and unmarried women, there's a marriage gap among men, but overall men are overrepresented as voters. Among unmarried women, their registration rates and their turnout rates do not match women as a whole or the electorate as a whole.
Do you know if this is unmarried straight women?
Yeah, I mean, we do have the data. It's basically that we lump non-straight women in with unmarried women to the extent that our data is able to.
Okay.
Which is not 100% accurate. That starts to get pretty fuzzy, as you might expect.
Sure, yeah. That's fair.
Okay. So, the reason that we're calling it the rising electorate is because as a percentage, since you started this effort, this percentage has grown year by year, not that they're rising up to take over the government. I just want for the one conservative listener that might be listening to this, this is about percentages of people, not taking away anything from you. No victimhood needed here. This is a larger percentage of people every year. Is that accurate? Is that why you're calling it rising?
Yeah, that's right. And just to give some actual put some numbers behind this, in 2016, in the presidential election, the rising American electorate constituted almost 60% of voter-eligible population, but only 52.6% of the actual people who voted on election day.
Okay, so in episode 9, we talked about cable and broadcast TV ads with our guest, John Rowley of Counterpoint Messaging. And then in episode 19, we talked with Chris Haler of Stone Phones about robocalls and things that you can do creatively with telephones. And we're missing this direct mail piece. And so instead of going to a direct mail consultant, we thought we'd just go right to the data and talk about its effectiveness and why people are still using it. And when you're talking about the work that you've done specifically, I just am thinking the cost is so, when you're talking about return envelopes, and I mean, you're sending a pretty big package that costs a lot to individual people that may or may not return their ballots. So what we're trying to do is understand why campaigns, why organizations like yours are still spending so much time on direct mail. So for folks who are unfamiliar, like millennials who can't find stamps necessarily, that report is still sticking with me. Can you just describe what direct mail is generally?
Yeah, absolutely. So direct mail encompasses a few different pieces of campaign or other political communication. So the most typical example you'll see on campaigns is it will be basically a postcard, maybe a bigger postcard, maybe 6 by 11 inches or 8.5 by 11 inches. It will have, if it's a positive postcard, it will have, a nice, happy photo of a candidate talking about what that candidate's going to do. If it's a negative piece of mail, it might have a scary-looking photo of the opponent, saying ways in which that candidate does not represent the values of whatever district you happen to be sending it.
It's probably in black and white with ominous coloring, makes someone look dark.
Yeah,
that's exactly right. Yeah, it is. There's an archetype of that type of communication. Yeah.
All right.
Sorry, go on.
There are other types of direct mail. I mean, one is there's the type of mail that the Voter Participation Center does, and I talked about the registration mail we do. The other two big things we do are we try to get people to request a vote by mail ballot, because we found that if we can get somebody to request that ballot, that increases their likelihood of turning out on election day. And then we will also send mail that we try to push people to vote. And I should say the Voter Participation Center is a nonpartisan organization, so we are not telling anybody who they should be voting for. We are just trying to encourage people to vote rather than not vote.
Right.
And then this sometimes gets treated as a different part of campaign communication, but then there's fundraising communication, because you might send out a run of mail where you're trying to get people to donate to you rather than to vote for you. And that is sort of a whole specialized other industry with various forms of best practices.
Right. And so the cost of this, aside from like TV ads, which are very, very costly because the purchasing of the time and the production can be quite costly, direct mail is a pretty expensive proposition for a campaign, even a down ballot campaign, where it might be more effective because the audience is smaller. You're talking about printing, postage, which is the big one, right? The big cost portion of this, and then maybe some design, photography costs that are associated with this. This is an expensive venture for folks, generally speaking.
Yeah, that's right.
So I want to talk a bit about why campaigns are still doing it. So, one of our favorite podcasts, Pod Save America, and its spinoff, The Wilderness, which is a 2016 autopsy, the best version of an autopsy that we're going to get of the 2016 election cycle. They spend an enormous amount of time bashing the political consultant class. I take no offense at it at all whatsoever. And they have recently spent some time going after direct mail and TV ads specifically. And I don't want you to spend any time, trying to defend the political class or the motives of political consultants. But I do want to spend a lot of time figuring out if direct mail is still effective. Is it really just about padding the consultants' pockets, or is direct mail still moving people? Why are we spending so much time and energy on it if their thesis is right that direct mail is just not effective anymore?
So the short answer is direct mail is still effective, and we have the data to prove it. Yes. When we run programs, one of the things that's really important for us is to understand, are we actually moving the needle? And so what we do is every time we run a program, we will hold out a control group that doesn't actually receive any of the mail we're sending. And we sometimes joke that we're actually, we operate maybe a little bit like a pharmaceutical company in how we run randomized controlled trials of our programs. That just happens to be what we're trying to sell is voting. Well, what we know in doing that, if you take for instance, 100 people and you send 90 of them a piece of mail or 50 of them a piece of mail and you don't send anything to the other 50. And then you can look at their behavior. You can see what were the registration rates among the people you mailed versus the people you didn't. What were the turnout rates among the people you mailed versus the people you didn't. You can then run a regression analysis, balancing out for all of the other factors that were, ongoing in this period of time. And then you can see that we can see that when we send out mail, we are absolutely making a difference. There are people who are registering who would not have registered if we hadn't mailed them, and there are people who are voting who would not be voting if we hadn't mailed them.
And so you're doing this after. I'm sorry. So you're doing this after every election cycle. So you're like, this has been done since the 2016 election cycle. When then there has been a definite shift in focus to digital ads. You've done this recently.
That's exactly right. And we're gearing up to run a really large-scale turnout program that won't entirely be in the mail, because we do run digital programs and we run SMS texting programs and phones programs. We don't do TV, so many others do. But the majority of it certainly will be in the mail. Very
cool. So I guess the question that I have that just comes to mind then is, you're spending this time and energy doing this. You're working with, I'm assuming, reputable pollsters or folks who do the data analysis portions of this that are really, you're just not like randomly choosing 90 people to direct mail to, and this is professionalized. There's science behind this, and you're using, Celinda Lake or Lake Research Partners or somebody that you've done polling with before to actually crunch the numbers and kind of track behavior.
Yeah, so we look at this in a couple of different ways. We have at various times, as you noted, worked with Celinda Lake, and we've worked with some other pollsters on tracking behavior and the attitudes and opinions of the people we're trying to reach. It is really, we have a in-house analytics shop that runs the actual numbers of who should we be mailing based on past results to figure out who do we think we would have the best odds of increasing their turnout or increasing their registration in any particular election cycle. And then at times we've also worked with third-party entities to basically run experiments and essentially be just a third-party validation to prove that whatever it is that we're finding is actually what happened.
All right. So this is not, some guesstimate exercise. There's some science behind this. Do you have percentages? Can you tell us generally what you think direct mail, what percentage it moves people based on these studies that you've done?
Yes. And that gets to a broader point we found about politics, which is changing behavior is really hard. I think many people have this idea, and I think I had this idea when I got started in politics, that, you run a great TV ad, or even you send out a great piece of mail, and suddenly, many people are seeing that, and they are then thinking, oh, maybe I should give whoever this candidate is, or whatever the cause is, whatever the action is, more, you're winning them over. And what we know is, yes, direct mail works. Everything, most things you do work, but all you're doing is moving the needle at the margins. So to give you some examples of this, we ran a turnout program in the gubernatorial election in Virginia in 2017. And we sent people 3 pieces of mail of what we call social pressure, which is a type of mail where we tell people that their voting record are public. You never know who somebody votes for, but whether or not you vote is public. And we prove it by saying, here is your voting record. In 2016, you voted, but you didn't vote in 2014. And compared to other voters in the Commonwealth of Virginia, you're about average, or maybe you're below average. And we've tested a couple of many different ways of sort of making that general argument. But in this instance, we sent voters the 3 pieces of mail that had that general argument. And when we looked at turnout after the election, we discovered that we increased turnout by about 6%. Another way of looking at that is we had a 2.8 percentage point increase on turnout. And we were really excited about that.
Yeah.
Because that is way bigger than what we have seen, for instance, in 2016 and what others have seen. In general, you might expect when you're looking at turnout that your best practices and how do you increase turnout might move somebody, around 1 percentage point.
Are there things that you have noticed are more effective in a direct mail piece than others? Or like what makes for the most effective piece?
I think that is that's a really complicated question, because I think that the answer is it really depends on what your specific goal is. One of the challenges, and I think campaigns have moved beyond this now, but one of the challenges is it's very easy to say, let's say you're running for state senate somewhere, and you have a universe of 20,000 people that you think are not 100% in your camp and are not 100% in the other camp. And so you could just take that universe of 20,000 people and mail them. Maybe you have a budget to mail them 6 times. And so you have a polling that says your jobs agenda is how you are going to win this election. And so that's what you do. And that it's hard to say for sure whether that type of communication is effective or not. It probably is. Nobody ever can measure that type of communication, because campaigns, especially smaller campaigns, are not going to say, okay, I actually don't want to talk to half of the people we need to talk to win, because on the off chance that I do win, I want to figure out how to be more effective next time around. That's really only something that can be done by an organization that, is going to be around after election day, regardless of the outcome of that election.
Well, I read on your website that you found that black and white mail pieces are better specifically for voter registration. Did I read that right? Yeah,
that's right. That is something we've tested. We've tested all sorts of different variations, and what we've found is for the work we do, black and white works better than something that's colorful. That we've also found that we don't want to talk at all about anything, issue-based or even remotely political. So our mail doesn't talk about, whether you feel a certain way about this country, you should register, or, whether you care about a certain issue, you should register. We just talk about how, registering to vote is the norm in this country. Whether or not you register to vote is also a matter of public record. And then we make it really easy to actually complete the process. And most of our mailing is just about how do you actually fill out the form and return it. But I think that the larger point is what works for us isn't going to work for somebody else and for a different purpose.
Right.
And that there is no longer this idea of one size fits all. And the thing you can do with mail is you can really vary it. For instance, let's say you are a campaign and a bunch of people are sending out these sort of the postcards, all these negative, pieces of communication we were talking about earlier. Maybe what you want to do is you want to send out letters from the candidate. And, the candidate can't personally handwrite 20,000 letters, but you can, you can put a typed letter from the candidate into an envelope. You can even get a RoboPen or some other approximation of a signature. You can do something like that that just stands out and feels different from other types of communication that's happening at that same time. And I think that's one of the really important things, is that you want to stand out, and that might mean doing going in a whole bunch of different directions. But in general, not looking like other things that are happening in the same, environment is going to be helpful, whether you're trying to increase turnout or trying to get people to vote a certain way or register or whatever the goal you're trying to achieve.
Yeah. So, so many questions about the social pressure. Like it sounds like it's a tested, tried and true methodology for increasing turnout. Why isn't every state party caucus on both sides of the aisle? I mean, obviously, I think on the right side, they don't necessarily want higher turnout, but in some races, they probably do. Why isn't everybody doing this? Is it only because it works in the voter registration / neutral turnout model? Is that one of the reasons why once you insert partisanship or issue-based stuff that it's not quite as effective? Why do you think this is not a universal?
So I think there's a bunch of reasons to that. I think your last point is correct, which is if you are a campaign, you are you really going to want to not talk at all about who you are, about your issues when you're trying to get people to turn out? You probably are going to want to do that. You are going to want to talk about yourself and why people should vote for you. And the best case scenario is that doesn't hurt. The worst case scenario, and there's been a bunch of different tests on this, and not every test always comes back with the same result. But the worst case scenario is the more you talk about yourself, the more you talk about why somebody should vote a different way, the less of an effect you have. And so you may just not be doing much at all with that piece of mail. But I think the other thing is that politics sort of exists in this ecosystem where different groups are doing different things. And, if you are a campaign, the thing that you are probably best at is talking about why Jane Smith should be in, the state Senate or Congress or, whatever the election is. And outside groups are probably better at doing this sort of turnout work because they're, the downside of social pressure is that, and there's various levels of how far you can go. There's a study in 2006, maybe 2008, I think, with an academic where they actually sent a letter to people and they said, here are your neighbors, here are their names, here are their voting records. And we're also sending you your voting record to them. And this letter had two effects. One is it had an enormous increase in turnout, a really massive increase in turnout. And also it made people extremely mad because essentially this, academic was sharing people's voting records with their neighbors. And while voting records are public, it's also not something that, it's not something that people aren't involved in politics spend a lot of time, accessing or thinking about. So right. The downside of social pressure is, especially if you, really go all in on it, it can make people mad. And if you're a candidate, if you make people mad, maybe they say, oh, well, I'm not voting for this candidate. So one of the reasons why the Voter Participation Center does it is our goal is increasing turnout. So, we don't do this most serious version of social pressure. We do various levels. Yeah. And if you get mad at us, that's fine. Right. As long as you still go and vote for whomever you would vote.
Right. Yeah. That's immediately what I thought of when you were talking about the social pressures. When I've done so much doorbelling, but when you go to the door and you're like, hello, Mr. Roberts, have you cast your ballot yet? Because we're an all absentee ballot state here, and people immediately get freaked out if you call them by their name. Mm-hmm. They're just off put. Like, who's this random stranger person who knows my name, and why are you at my doorstep? And so that's the first thing that I thought of when you talked about that, is that there's probably a segment of people that get really freaked out when confronted with that information. Okay, so we're a podcast for down ballot races, non-federal, down ticket. races. Do you think that there are things that down ballot campaigns can be doing to increase their effectiveness when it comes to their direct mail? So it sounds like you're advocating very strongly for not a one size fits all, type of mail piece, which I think obviously makes sense, and no consultant hopefully is advocating for that necessarily. But I will say that, I do direct mail myself as part of the suite of services that we provide campaigns. And the pressure for us is that 20 seconds between the mailbox and the counter, or the 20 seconds between the mailbox and the recycling bin, you have to try to capture their attention in some way, shape, or form. So the mail is getting louder, more sarcastic or clever, more interactive. If you can, do die cuts and things that, stand out a bit more from your, Spiegel or IKEA catalogs, there's pressure for us to sort of do something that's more out of box and louder, more sarcastic or attention grabbing. And that may not always be effective, especially based on the feedback that you've been providing us. So I'm wondering if there are just some general tools that some down ballot campaigns who may or may not have consultants could use to really get their mail to move people in the direction that they want to do it. What have you seen that works well?
So, again, I think it really depends on specifically what you're trying to do and who your target audience is. I mean, a mail piece, if the people you need to win are, seniors, your mail is going to look very different than if the people you need to win are Gen Xers. One thing we found, just incidentally, is our mail, we know that our mail works among everybody, but also it is not equally effective among all people. And as you might expect, the older you are, the more effective mail is. Mm-hmm. Now, with the caveat that we do continue to mail millennials because it works among millennials. This doesn't work quite as well. And so on our standpoint, when we start to run digital or SMS programs, those are programs we start by prioritizing millennials because we know that that's where we most need to round out our effects. So I think the thing number one is, how you design a mail program depends a lot on who you're targeting.
Yeah.
And I love a good die cut. I used to work at a mail firm myself.
Wait, what does that mean? I don't know what that means.
Rainey is not a consultant.
I'm not a consultant.
She's our everyday one-person focus group.
So a die cut is when you essentially have a non-standard format for mail, and generally the way this works is you are essentially you are sending a mail piece that's designed to look like something specific. So maybe you are talking about schools a lot, and so you have a mail piece that looks like a school bus.
Got it.
It's that sort of thing.
Okay, got it.
And it stands out. Now, I have no research on whether it is more effective than just sending just a regular letter about schools, but my totally non-scientific gut feeling is if schools are what you need to talk about to win, you should probably do both. You should be communicating in as many different ways as possible because different types of people are going to respond to different ways of communicating. That's why you shouldn't only do mail, but also within your mail program, this is why you want to vary what you're sending as much as you can.
Fair. Okay, you've been very generous with your time. So I've got one last question about voter drop-off and the drop-off that you noticed between 2016 and the midterms. You have done some research and you estimate about 40 million Americans who cast ballots in 2016 will not likely do it in the midterms this year in 2018. And so for folks who are not tracking like historical trends and watching this stuff closely, what does that mean exactly? And is that better or worse than what typically happens between a presidential year and the midterms? Is there reason for panic on this?
So there's good news and there's bad news here, as is often the case. The good news, if you are hoping for a higher turnout midterm in 2018, is that this is not factoring in what, special election turnout and, all of the signs that suggest that turnout's going to be higher in 2018 than in past midterms. This is just looking at census data for the demographics who turn out in presidential years versus midterm years. And we do see this, we see a big drop off, and we know that it's especially big among the rising American electorate. So in thinking about how will 2018 actually turn out, we have seen increased turnout in special elections. We see increased turnout in primary elections. If you look at polling, you see more people expressing excitement about voting. But the bad news, of course, is turnout will still be down from a presidential year. And without a lot of work, and this is one of the things we're working on, it will be especially, the drop-off will be especially large among the rising American electorate. And you can see that also in special elections, where some of the voters that have been increasing their performance the most over past elections tend to be college-educated white people who are great. I'm a college-educated white person myself, but certainly not underrepresented in the electorate.
Right.
Cool. Thank you so much for your time today. Can you tell us where we can learn more about the Voter Participation Center?
You can learn more at our website, voterparticipation.org, and we have a whole compendium of some of the research we've done on the rising American electorate and on their past voting and behaviors, as well as just on the overall programs that we run. And if you are not registered to vote, and I hope that all of the listeners of this podcast are registered to vote, but if you're not, you can also update your registration on our site via our online voter registration tool.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody at the Voter Participation Center for your yeoman's work.
Amazing
we really
work.
appreciate everything that you're doing to increase turnout. It's amazing. And thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Great. Have a good one.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye. Another big thank you to Lionel Dripps of the Voter Participation Center for joining us today. What a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, that was super, super great and full of data, which I love.
What did you think?
Well, I think it was really interesting. I brought this up as a question. I think it's the most interesting to me that the black and white mailers that are most effective for getting people to register to vote. It's really, I like design details and data and interesting things.
Yeah, it runs counter, I think, to what you may think when you're designing these things, and that it should be eye-catching and loud
colorful and flashy and
right.
And like he said, the smiling picture of the people.
It's interesting. So there's an annual conference of political consultants that happens every year, the Poly Awards. Mm-hmm. You went with me this year. We did a couple episodes from the Poly Awards, and they did it was like a breakout session. Maybe it was 2 or 3 years ago, where some folks with some data behind them came in and said, we're going back to the more loud colors, the sort of like bright reds and American blues, and not overly designed, slick looking mail pieces, because people are getting kind of Pavlovian about it. They're like recognizing political mail and discarding it before even looking at it, because it's sort of following a typical mode. So I wonder if that has something to do with it, the black and white. I wonder if
it just looks more official. Yeah. Like it's not coming as something to sell you.
Yeah.
It looks like, I should respond to this like a bill or something like that. I remember there being a bunch of backlash about a political ad that came. I don't know if it was Seattle only, if it was all of Washington state, but it looked very much like you had missed a utility bill payment or something. And the whole point was the social pressure concept of, you must register to vote. You have until this deadline. Right. But people were super mad about it because they had a panic that, oh my God, did I miss paying a bill? Right. And no, it turns out it's just reminding you to vote. But that speaks to what he was saying about, we don't care if we piss people off. We just want you to actually register and follow through.
And there was a Ted Cruz mailer that they just sent out that looked like a jury summons, if I remember correctly. And people got really pissed about that too.
Yeah.
So yeah, I suppose it's something about the official looking nature of it that is helpful. So yeah, that was a fantastic discussion, and really happy that we got some data behind what we've, suspected, which is that the reason that campaigns are still using these methodologies is because there is some positive effect on campaigns. So
it's not motivated by how much money you make.
Right. I mean, part of when I heard that, it was like, well, consultants will just make money on digital ads. They're not going to sacrifice,
right,
their cut of this. They'll just take a different cut from a different medium. And really the vested interest of consultants is that they want to win. And so there's a direct relationship between the amount of voter contact that you do, the types of voter contact that work, and the win record of a consultant. Like, all of those things are tied together. Right. It's not strictly about the money. Anyway, so yeah. So
take that, Jon Favreau.
Well, it's, it's such a brilliant podcast, but they have made this point over and over, and it didn't sit well with me. And so and not just because I am a political consultant, but more because I just don't think necessarily that I just don't think 100% of that is necessarily accurate or applicable. So, listeners, what did you think? We would love to know more about what you thought about this particular episode. Hop on over to iTunes, Apple Podcast, Google Play Music, wherever you listen to us. Subscribe, leave us a comment, send us an email, podcast@electionu.com.
We love it.
Yeah, we do. We listen to it. And as we've noted many times before, the ideas that you present to us for episodes, topics on episodes, categories, whatever we can discuss, we have used them. Several of our recent episodes came directly from our listeners. So don't hesitate to email us, podcast@electionu.com. So
awesome.
Until next week, this is Jason Bennett signing off.
And I'm Rainey Cohen.
We'll catch you next week. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This week's episode has ended, but the campaign fun doesn't have to. Head on over to www.electionu.com, where you can access all of the links mentioned in today's episode, as well as the show notes. There you can also sign up for regular announcements or register for our campaign school. It's your very own online personal trainer for winning campaigns. www.electionu.com. Click, learn, win.